Hi. I can't get this out. There we go.
Hi, everyone.
This is nice. This is leisurely. I like
This
this.
is.
This is fancy.
I like our Black Lodge curtaining. This is really good.
Yeah, it really
This is nice.
it gives it an air of professionalism that I enjoy.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone. We are here to talk with each other.
I like talking.
I like talking, too. My family doesn't like my talking, but I like to talk. So this is your deal. The book came out yesterday. It Devours.
Yeah.
Came
Look
out
at this
yesterday.
beautiful cover.
So happy book birthday.
Thank you.
That experience of opening the box, when the box shows up and you see it and you know what it is and you open it. What's that like for you guys? I always get sort of vaguely nauseous and dizzy when it happens. What about you guys?
I mean, it's such a physically beautiful book. Rob Wilson, who designed the Welcome to Night Vale logo and then designed everything on the outside of that book, did just such a tremendous job that it really is. I was blown away when I saw it. It is a weird thing, I think, when these days to make a living as an artist, you have to have about 10 different projects going at once. So there is this very triumphant thing when you have a book come out, but you're also looking at the podcast episodes you're working on for the 2 different podcasts you have currently running and trying to, and so there's this less of this feeling of completion than there is just of this is amazing, now let me see what's going on with the 5 other projects.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing too, because the thing about publishing is that we turned the final edit of this book in last the 1st of November. So it's been gone from our hands for almost a year now. Yeah. And in fact, we were in edits before that anyway, so it was, wasn't that right? Or we had a couple more edits after
Yeah, because we were editing in London in November. So I think we finished the book, the actual writing of it, probably in September or August.
Yeah, so we're this book is a full year removed from us writing it, so it's a weird thing to then all of that time you spent writing and then you get a box and you're like, here's all of the many hours that I spent the entire year we spent writing this thing, and it's in this little object, which is kind of cool actually, that all of that hard work is contained here.
Bittersweet sense of letting it go, because it has been out. Do you have the experience where you look at it after so long and you'll see some stuff in there that you don't remember writing, that you have no conscious memory of putting on paper?
All the time. I mean, we were at a panel at New York Comic Con and the person who was moderating brought up a passage, and I just had no idea what he was talking about. It was a fairly lengthy passage. The passage about this, and he had to show me in the book because it just had been so long since we had worked on that I just had forgotten it was in there.
Wow. Oh, that reminds me.
Yeah. What do you have presents for us?
Hold on, we're getting presents.
When anybody goes into their bag and says, "Hang on a second."
Daddy bought presents for everybody.
Whoa, cups.
And we've got.
Oh.
Don't drink alcohol. That's fine. But if you do, we have some celebratory champagne.
Oh, very nice. Thank you, Jason. Yeah.
A book birthday is a big deal. Now, this thing has been in my backpack, so it is going to explode everywhere.
Do you want to come to Atlanta with us tomorrow?
I will be going to Atlanta.
This reminds me, we have a couple times we've done in San Francisco events with an author friend of ours who had a wine buying addiction, I'd almost say. Basically, his accountant eventually told him he was not allowed to buy wine anymore, but he was just trying to get rid of his collection, so he would always just bring a few bottles to the event and just start putting them out on the table during it.
He brought, I don't know wine well enough, but I do know that I think it was in 1994 that he brought us 2 years ago.
Oh, it was very, very expensive French wine that he was bringing. It was not stuff that we could afford.
I felt kind of bad because I'm like, this tastes very good, but I don't know that I would know that this is better than Yellowtail.
No. No, we were not the most appreciative audience, but.
So I have a question about process of writing a book. I'm a novelist and I write other things as well. Anyone here know Rip Tracks? Do you guys know Rip Tracks? I'm a Rip Tracks contributor and have been for a long time. So the podcast has to sound a certain way, like avoid sounding written. You know, when Alec reads it, has to sound natural. It has to sound like words people say. And that's different than when you write. The process of writing a novel where prose can be novelistic. And one of the notes we get a lot is, this line is funny, but it sounds like a line that is written to be read, not written to be heard.
Yeah.
Did you find that was a thing? You know, when I'm reading the book, it sounds like Night Vale, but it also sounds like a novel. You know what I mean?
I think one of the things when we approach any storytelling, whether it's the podcast or whether it's writing a Welcome to Night Vale novel or whether it's doing our touring live show, has to do, the first question that we always have to answer is like, how do we write for whatever medium this is, right? So if you're gonna write a Welcome to Night Vale script for a touring live show, it has to acknowledge the presence of the audience. You have to do something with the audience there. You can't just pretend they're not in the room with you. And with a, writing the novel, like one of the things is that like when we write the podcast script, when we go through the editing process, when we go through the editing process, we will actually like read the script out loud to ourselves to make sure that the words roll off correctly as you speak them.
And not just like read, I don't know about you, but I will do my best. You know, I'm not an actor, but I will do my best to act it just to get a sense of the rhythm of that to make sure it works when performed that way.
Yeah. And with a novel, you can sort of, you can lay back a little bit more. You can sort of play with the language. You can write sentences. I think the first Night Vale novel, I think the last 2 pages of that novel are one single sentence, and so, but it was a thing that works really well in the way that what that sentence is doing. But it's also a thing where, like, I would never give Cecil a 2-page long sentence.
Right, yeah. It wouldn't be something you would perform.
He would throw the microphone at me, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he sometimes gets mad if we have, like, 2 clauses in there. It starts to get hard to track in your acting.
What about the difference between writing a script together, a podcast script together, and writing a piece of long-form fiction together? Because that's a mountain, you know? Not that the podcasts are easy to write, I don't mean that. You're about 120 some odd episodes?
116 in now?
Yeah, I mean, I was editing 118 on the plane.
Yeah. So a tremendous amount of writing, but something that's presented in a compact, format.
Yeah.
Whereas a piece of long-form fiction is, again, it is like climbing a mountain every time you stop. So how do you keep from murdering each other while you're?
Yeah, I mean, that part, I don't know. We generally get along. People sometimes ask, like, what was your biggest fight? And there really hasn't been. We just don't. I mean, I think there's a trusting each other and to pick our battles. Like, if we disagree about a story point, we'll just be like, well, you seem like you have a sense of this, so let's go with that. Our writing process is the same. As Jeffrey said, what we're writing, what we're doing with it is different depending on whether it's a novel or a live show or a podcast. But the actual writing process is something we've been doing for about 7 years now, probably a little over 7 years. And so that is pretty solid and is the same no matter what we're doing. Have you ever seen the movie Ghost? Because it's kind of like that.
Sure.
Yeah, it's like the pottery scene. Yeah, it's really cool. It's sort of like that. It's like an Apple laptop there. And then I like guide Joseph's fingers over
No, we go.
That image.
We kind of split up the work and we go our separate ways and we write and then we exchange what we've written and edit it and talk about it. Sometimes the editing is just, this is really funny. I added one joke. And sometimes it's like, hey, I think I see where you're trying to go with this story, but I think it landed a little weird, so maybe let's think about it. Like, sometimes it's bigger picture stuff like that. With a novel, there's a lot more of that because you're trying to make a much bigger story land. So there's a lot of like, this chapter is very funny and works great on its own, but we just have to make sure, like, does it make sense that this character is acting that way this early in the book? Should we think about the pacing of that? So there is, I think, a lot more big picture conversations, whereas with a podcast, because it is ongoing, we can just kind of play it by ear. And one of us can make a decision that changes things for the town, and then it can just be a fun thing of like, well, let's just build on that and see where it goes. Whereas with a novel, since you have to land it in this kind of neat little package at the end, you do need to have a sense of where every plot strand is going.
Yeah. One thing that impressed me, and you do this with the podcast as well, the insistence that you don't need to be familiar with the entire 116 episodes of Night Vale to jump into this. And even that you can jump into the podcast at any point, even listen to it backward if you want. How do you pull that off? Because now as you get, that seems like something that's easier to do when you're 10, 15, 20 installments in versus 2 novels and 116 episodes.
I mean, we do get asked that a lot, which is as we've gotten more and more episodes. Because when you have 28 episodes, it's a lot easier for somebody just to say, "All right, I hear this is good. I'll start at number 1." But when you have 116 episodes, we do get the question of like, where do I start? Do I need to start at the beginning? And here's the thing: no, you really don't. I mean, there are some episodes where you came in, you would be more lost than other episodes, but it is an ongoing serial story about this town told from the point of view of the radio host, really. Right. And so this isn't Lost. This isn't The Leftovers. Like, you can't start Leftovers season 3 and understand what's going on, because it is, in a way, those TV shows are like novels, right? Like, they have a beginning, middle, and end. And with Night Vale, with the podcast, there is no beginning, middle, and end. We have certain arcs that we'll follow through with, but there's no like final chapter of Night Vale. There will be one day a last episode because of the way humans tend to not live infinitely. So, but there is but we haven't built the show as like this 7-part Harry Potter novel series, right? Like it really is a place where I feel like if you just moved to a city and you heard a radio station was really great, you could jump on there and you'll be like, I don't know who these people talking are, but they seem to laugh a lot and tell funny jokes and play funny drops from from Family Guy all the time. But maybe that's your thing, but I think you'll get the hang of it soon enough. You'll learn who the local people are in the town, what the news stories are, and I think Night Vale is the same way.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very inviting. It draws you in, and that's another thing I wanted to talk about too. The Cecil's delivery of the tone. So you have this town, and you have all these amazing and surreal and uncanny and weird and awful and awesome in the earlier senses of those words happening all the time. And yet Cecil delivers the news about these events in this laconic, bored, matter-of-fact tone, which really is this interesting tension between all this weird stuff that's happening, and then Cecil's just kind of like he's reading the weather, Was that part of the original conception that the narrator would... I mean, because this very easily could have been like Panic in Night Vale, where everything is a new emergency, and but he seems used to it. He seems inured to it.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the heart of the show. Kind of the base rock of Night Vale that we keep going back to if we need to be guided forward is that the more weird something is, the more mundane you write it. The more mundane something is, the more weird you write it. If you're writing about something that's in everyday life, you really try to alienate it and make it seem very strange and scary. But if you're writing just about like an alien invasion, then you write it as everyday as you can. Right. The delivery that Cecil does, we have a very unusual directing style, I think, for an ongoing fiction show for anything really, which is we don't direct much. We try to direct as little as possible. We do a lot of just letting actors make choices, and then trusting the choices they make, and that creates this kind of loop where we also write the scripts in a way that really tries to guide them toward a performance. The text we're writing is not super open to interpretation. We really do try to guide them through an emotional journey with that text. But at the same time, sometimes they make choices that are just completely different than what we would have expected. And the key there is, instead of fighting it, you build on it. You make the decision, okay, that is what that character did, and then you write based on that, which then they act based on. A good example of this is the character Steve Carlsberg, played by Hal Lublin, who was originally this kind of joke character that it was just someone that the narrator Cecil really hated. We didn't know a lot about him other than he was apparently very annoying. But then we brought in Hal to play him, and Hal is, first of all, just one of the nicest, most likable people I've ever met in my life, just as a person. And he really brings that on stage. You can feel that he is the loveliest human being. And so he plays Steve as the loveliest human being. And so then you get this dissonance that Cecil apparently hates this guy who appears to be the loveliest human being. And that has really, I think, changed the dynamic of that character and changed the dynamic between those characters, is building on Hal's incredibly likable performance as Steve.
I really, by the way, just the anecdote of that is the very first time Hal performed Steve was, it was our first Brooklyn show, our first New York show before we ever really started touring, and we wrote just a one-off script for that night. And we had a bunch of the folks from the Thrilling Adventure Hour show in town, and they just were like, some of these guys would love to do your show if you want to write a part for them. And so we didn't really know what to do, and we just kind of randomly assigned a lot of parts. And there was just one moment where it's like a call-in, and Steve Carlsberg calls in, and Cecil just yells at him. And we just randomly assigned Hal to it, and Hal was just like, hey, it's Steve Carlsberg. And Cecil's like, hang up, Steve. And everyone booed at Steve. And Hal was really just like wide-eyed. And then when he came out for the curtain call, people booed again. He was like... and it was really funny, but a couple times into our first tours,
and then after that show, he went up to us and he was like, "That character is mine. That is me.
That's canon now. I'm Steve." And then we started touring, and we brought Hal on some tour stops, and we would have these full-on conversations between Steve Carlsberg and Cecil, and Cecil would continue to hate on him and mistreat him and be rude to him. And it was really amazing because people turned on Cecil then. People started getting really uncomfortable with how he was treating Steve, and Steve would look a little taken aback, and people would, oh. So it really was this turning point because of the casting of Hal.
Yeah, that's great. That's fascinating. I'm looking at my notes here, and I see I've got, this is my note-taking style.
I like it.
I've got 2012 written on one note card, underlined, and
Beautiful.
nothing else.
Do you want to talk about 2012?
Mm-hmm. 2012, the year 20...
I assume you mean the movie?
Yes. Yes, I do. No, but this thing started in 2012, right?
It did.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did you
June
have,
15th,
June
2012.
15th? No. Did you have any conception at all? Because this was a... What's the term? A podcast-rich environment at that time? I mean, there was a tremendous amount of competition for people's attention. Did you have any conception at all that this thing would take off the way it has? And
no to that.
Yeah, no, it is interesting because it's interesting that you phrase it that way, because I think you're absolutely right. There was a lot of stuff going on. People are like, well, you got into podcasting very early on in podcasting, which is it is true. We got in before Serial, which completely changed things forever in podcasting. The world of podcasting before and after Serial just looks completely different. But at the time, I did feel like, wow, we're getting to this so late, because I had been listening to podcasts regularly since around 2004, 2005. Ever since the very early comedy ones, and also This American Life started saying, hey, you can download an MP3 of this at our website.
right.
Yeah, it was a thing of we both, Jeffrey and I, really loved podcasts, and we wanted to make one, but we knew that it couldn't sound like the stuff that was happening because they were already doing it better than we could. But what wasn't happening, for the most part, there were a few shows, Thrilling Adventure Hour is a prime example, but there wasn't a lot of fiction, and we're both fiction writers, and so it just made sense at the time to be like, let's try writing fiction and put it out there, because there's not a lot of people doing that.
Right.
But it really was that was as far as our thought process went. There was no plan to it. It was just this I think will be a fun thing to do. Let's try it.
Let's try it, yeah. I've always sort of been surprised that there's not been more of a renaissance of the old radio dramas, in terms of that. We do get stuff like Serial. We do get stuff that is, sort of nonfiction based, and it does seem like such a rich format. And I think what you guys are doing proves that it can work. and people will find it and love it. But as far as like influences go, what made you want to do this thing? It wasn't just that other people weren't doing it. I mean, Night Vale is a very specific thing. I don't know why it's not quite right, but when I think about it, I think about like old EC comics from the 50s and 60s.
Oh wow. Mm-hmm.
It's got that vibe for me for some reason. But as far as like your influences, what drew you to this type of story as opposed to any other type of story?
I don't know. It's interesting because when we started Night Vale, I don't really think we had an idea of what Night Vale was. Like when Joseph wrote the pilot episode, like I didn't get a sense in talking to you that like you were like, oh, here's this shape of this town and kind of the tone of the show. It was like, here's a thing I made and I recorded it with Cecil and put it together, and then we then sat down and had to figure out like, well, let's write more episodes like this, and so we modeled the next several episodes and kind of off of that pilot, the structure of it and the weirdness. And I for me anyway, I mean, I think, I've always loved the absurd. I've always loved. I like comedy a lot, and I like absurd imagery, and I've always been drawn to, I think an easy reference point would be Twin Peaks, but I also, grew up reading, I think the first book I fell in love with as a child was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and I think that type of, because that literal dream imagery, spoiler, it's a dream, that literal dream imagery is this really, I found it really scary as a kid. Like, it really scared me to read it because it didn't make any sense. People behaved, or characters behaved in ways that didn't make any logical sense whatsoever. But it was also funny at the same time, and that navigating between horror and comedy is really fun. So I think that book has always had a really profound influence on me, given how much I read it as a kid. So I think probably I always come back to some sense of absurdity in my writing.
Books.
Yeah, I think Jeffrey's right that there wasn't a sense of the world, I think, in those first Night Vale episodes yet. I think Night Vale at the start was way more the language we used. We were we were trying to create a very specific, I think, kind of language with Night Vale. And we talk regularly about, I think, kind of the two authors, or the two writers that contributed directly to what the language that Night Vale became. Right. One is a playwright named Will Eno from Massachusetts. He's had a number of shows in New York. But he writes these very strange confrontational works that use language as this way of disorienting the audience.
Right.
And he builds beautiful images and then tears them up in front of you. He wrote a play called Tom Paine Based on Nothing that in its original run starred the amazing James Urbaniak, who's now been on Night Vale. But there's a point towards the end of the show where he needs an audience volunteer. He brings an audience volunteer on stage, thanks them for coming up, and then continues the show and ignores them, and they just stand there for the rest of the show while he finishes it. So Will Eno was a big influence that Jeffrey brought. I had never read anything by him, and he showed me, and then Will Eno regularly has plays in New York, so I started going and seeing them. And then the other is a novelist named Deb Olin Unferth. Most specifically, a novel she wrote about 10 years ago, probably, called Vacation. That I had just moved to New York. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have a ton of money, so I bought. It was like a bargain bin thing. It had a cool cover, and I read it, and then I just started over and read it again, because it's one of those books, and I feel like every writer reaches these books where you think you know how to write, and then you read them and you're like, I don't know how to do this. This is so much better than I know how to do, and I need to learn what she's doing. Right. And so I started it right over and started really trying to pay attention. What are you doing? Yeah. How are you? 'Cause she just does magic tricks with words. It's not that her stories end in places you don't expect, or even her paragraphs. She will start a sentence in one place and then just land it somewhere you never saw her landing it. Mm-hmm. So those two mixed together, I think, really constituted early Night Vale in what we were trying to do with language.
This is insane, but it reminds me a little bit of the sort of meditative quality, the way that Cecil delivers the lines, the music that kind of lulls around in the background. Do you guys know the poet Rod McEwen? Sort of a popular poet. in the 60s, 70s, and he cut
don't,
albums, and do you know my friend, the sea? And there would be the sound effects in the background, and it was very peaceful and tranquil. It reminds me a little bit of that. It's like a Rod McEwen were the narrator in an H.P. Lovecraft story.
Sure, yeah.
There's this beautiful poetic, scary quality, but you can also, I found listening to the podcast like really relaxing in a way. It lulls you into this sense of the current. A lot of that is just the way that the language plays around.
I think one of the compliments we started when we started actually doing live shows, so we could like go out and we started meeting people who were fans of our show. We would hang out after the show and sign posters and stuff. And the most common compliment we would get, and it took me a while to receive it as a compliment, was, "I love your show so much, it puts me to sleep."
Yeah.
But I totally get that now, because my absolute favorite podcasts are the ones I fall asleep to.
Yeah.
Those are the ones I put on when I want to fall asleep because they're comforting.
I loved it, by the way, that a year ago, Joseph had not listened. Do you guys know the My Brother and Me? Joseph had not heard that podcast before, and then now has started listening in the past year to it. And the other day was like, "That's elevated to my I fall asleep to this podcast." I was like, "Oh, they are top tier now. That's so great."
Yeah, it was weird. We did an event with Justin McElroy of that show, and he was so great, and I had not listened to his show. And then now I love his show, and I'm like, oh, I wish I had known who he was when we did an event with him.
No, you don't, because I knew who he was, and I had like shake hand just standing near him. Hi, it's so nice to meet
I
you.
used to fall asleep to Art Bell. Do you guys know Art Bell?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know why. I just found Art's like his spiraling insanity was relaxing to me, because it's like, no, my day wasn't that bad.
Art Bell was amazing because he had that. There are two qualities of him that I really liked when I was able to get his show on my radio in my bedroom as a kid, which was one, like, it gave you this sense of like there's this like kind of like it was a national call-in show. It's this idea of like his like east of the Rockies, you're on the air, like that type of line is really great because you would sit there and say like, oh, these are all over the country, and also just he was like it was like a rodeo. Like he could just get on that Bronco and just calmly ride it, and he would get the nuttiest people, but he knew how to like extract a story from them. He knew when to stop them. He knew when to ask the next question, and it's a real mastery of like how to interview people,
like shaping this madness every night and turning it into a thing that's
because he wanted to cultivate the craziest conspiracy he could out of them.
Yeah. So it's a good time for you guys to be here. It's almost Halloween. Mm-hmm.
I love Halloween, and I have not had a Halloween at home in 3 or 4 years. We're always on tour during Halloween.
What's like the most Night Vale thing that's ever happened to you personally?
The success of Night Vale? That's been weird.
What's that?
The success of Night Vale. That's
very true. Yeah.
Surreal as hell.
Yeah. That's a really good question. There's definitely things in my life. I'll use this example, and I've talked about this before, and it actually became an episode in Night Vale. But back in 2004, I think it was, I was in New Orleans for a teacher's conference when I was a teacher, and I had a friend that lived in Jackson, Mississippi, and so I'd gotten in early that morning, and I didn't have conference till the next day, so I was like, I'm going to drive to Jackson and go have dinner with my friends. And so I did that, and then I drove home late, and I'm driving back late, and if you know southern Louisiana, it's all swampland, and all the highways are elevated, little low bridges, so there's no really like getting off the highway. And then I was the only person on the road, and I just saw a bright light up ahead, and I couldn't tell it was a bright orange light. And then as I got closer, I was like, that's a fire. I see a fire up ahead, and so I started slowing, and then I got up closely, and I'm like, that's a car on fire. And I was like, oh no, this is really bad. And so I got up there, and the car looked completely hollowed out, and I was slowing down because I'm like, I think I need to pull over and call 911 and do whatever. As I'm pulling over, the car's on fire, and about 40 feet up ahead is just a guy leaning on the guardrail, just smoking a cigarette. Just like casually just hanging out, just having a cigarette with the 40 feet from this car on fire, just chilling out. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to make the call and keep driving. And
Wow.
Anyways, yeah, that was, we ended up putting that in the Man in the Tent Jacket episode, but it was a Yeah, it was a really very surreal thing.
I grew up in rural Southern Illinois, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. I grew up in a water district. It was like between two towns under a water tower. So there was all kinds of, you were always afraid of the farmer who lived in that farmhouse, the person who owned this patch of land. I think for me though, my grandfather, when I was a kid, he owned a tool and die factory, and they made parts for washers, dryers, things like that, ovens. And they worked a rotating shift, so there was a night shift. And for a full year, I think it was, Coke quality machine and tool was haunted by a fiend who came to be known as the Phantom Pooper. Although they didn't call him Pooper, they called him the Phantom Esser. I don't think we're allowed to swear in here. He
Live
would
your life,
poop
man.
in desk drawers. He would poop on the machine tooling. He would poop on conveyor belts in the offices, on office chairs. And they never caught this man. They never caught this villain. And I've never entirely been convinced that he wasn't actually some disembodied thing, with GI distress and a grudge against my grandfather.
I'm sort of tickled by the idea of, as I think about, man, if ghosts are real and I could come back as a ghost, I think about all of the things I would want to do, learn about people and see places in the world I've never been. And this guy's like, yeah, if I were a ghost, I would totally crap on things.
Now I'm wondering, do you think that the ghosts at haunted houses are just people who were big horror fans in life? And then when they died and became a ghost, they were like, oh, this is great. I can recreate my favorite haunted house story.
They're the truest cosplayers. Yeah.
Exactly. All ghosts are just cosplaying other ghosts they were.
Other ghost stories. We should start calling them on it. It's like,
Yeah.
I know this. This is from Paranormal Activity 3.
You got this from Poltergeist.
You lazy
This is my
ghost
afterlife
bastard.
headcanon, sure, yeah.
No, but it was this absurd experience. You talked to my grandfather, like, how's things going? He's like, it's good. Your grandmother's good. The Phantom Pooper struck again. We were this close to catching him this time.
It's amazing.
I think we're going to read soon.
Let's
Is that
do a
right?
reading of a thing.
I think we're going to hear some from It Devours.
All right. Hey guys, we wrote a book. It's called It Devours, and I'm going to read you a segment from it. All right, this is, I'm going to read from chapter 3 for you. Here we go. Nilanjana had no interest in Carlos. And anyway, he was married to the local community radio host, Cecil Palmer. Still, she couldn't not notice that he was, in his way, stunningly handsome. Even his frown was perfect, and he ran his hands perfectly through his perfect hair. In science, of course, there's always a lot of pressure to look good. Appearances are a major part of a science career. And top scientists face all sorts of accusations of plastic surgery and unhealthy diets, a constant scrutiny in gossip magazines and tabloid blogs. But Carlos stayed out of all of that. He was a beautiful person, but that never interested him much. He only cared about two things, his scientific work and his family. Nilanjana didn't know Carlos's family well. She knew his teenage niece, Janice, was born with spina bifida, and while her frequent checkups of eyes, kidneys, and spine came back healthy each time, Carlos would take days off work to be with her and his brother and sister-in-law. Nilanjana knew that his husband, Cecil, sometimes faced serious dangers as a reporter in a town as full of terrible secrets as Night Vale, and those dangers sent Carlos into a worried stupor. He would pace about the office, trying not to call the station to ask if Cecil was okay. Not much got done in the lab when Carlos fretted for Cecil's safety. She could tell when Carlos had a date night planned because he put gel in his hair and wore his most striking lab coat. She was uncertain why Carlos wanted to talk to her now. She hoped that the problem was with his scientific work. She didn't have much to say on the subject of being in love. Not that she hadn't had boyfriends. She was a human being of adult age with an interest in other human beings, and she had been in relationships starting from high school. But she did not feel qualified to offer advice on the subject. She was just stumbling along the same as anyone. It was occasionally fun and often lonely, whether she was with someone at the time or not. Carlos interrupted this reverie by pulling down a chart that said, in large letters, Science. Today's topic of discussion is science. I've provided a visual aid. Oh, thank God. He gestured for her to sit, but she didn't like sitting much, and so she gestured that she would rather stand. And there was some gesturing back and forth that neither of them understood. Finally, Carlos sat, and she remained standing. I know you're aware of the house, he began. The general concept of houses? Sorry, the house that doesn't exist. He pulled down another chart. It had a picture of a house on it. Oh, yes, she said, I know that house. It doesn't exist. It looks like it exists, like it's right there when you look at it, and it's between two other identical houses, so it would make more sense for it to be there than not, but it doesn't actually exist, he finished. Right, it's a weird house, or it isn't a weird house. It's weird, but not a house. It's hard to know how to talk about it. Everyone in town knew about the house that looks like it exists but doesn't. There was a common dare among scientists to knock on the door and then run away. Carlos himself had once entered the house. He didn't talk much about this. Anytime the topic came up, he would wave it off or try to change the subject. What Nilanjana had learned from his research notes was that its interior was entirely different from that of the common prefab house it seemed to be when one peered through its windows. Seen from the inside, the house contained no furniture and no decorations except a small black and white photo of a lighthouse. The house was not a house, but an entryway to a desert otherworld, vast and empty. There was a single mountain in that other world, and it was completely believable to all who saw it. At the top of the mountain was the lighthouse from the photo. There had been a cold light emanating from all around, though the sun was never visible. Hypothesis. The desert otherworld had been cold and empty and had made Carlos feel lost to the people he loved. Carlos cared more than anything about the people he loved, and so a place with no one and nothing in it had been traumatizing for him. Ever since Carlos's return from the other world a few years back, everyone in the lab knew he had been obsessed with the house. And like most obsessions with the truth, this had made the city council nervous. Your job as being a scientist, the council had told him, via an empty-eyed child messenger who had helpfully lunged out at him from the shower when he had gotten up to pee in the middle of the night. So look pretty and write papers. Don't go searching around for the truth. You're a scientist, not a snoop. Man, said Nilanjana as he told her about the message from the council. Yes, it was upsetting, said Carlos. And then, of course, I was stuck with an empty-eyed child messenger, and you know how long it takes the city council to come back around and pick them up. We ended up having to give her rides to school for the next 3 weeks. Oh, we're going to her 8th grade graduation tomorrow. Oh, cute. Super cute. But I won't let the city council dissuade me from preventing anyone else from being hurt by that other world. They've been trying to stop me. Thank you.
That's lovely.
Thanks.
And hilarious. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. I think that's the
Yeah, let's do
Is that
that.
right?
Yeah.
So questions for Joseph and Jeffrey.
You do it.
All the interviews that you've done, what's one thing that you've always wanted to talk about that's never been brought up?
Dallas Cowboys football. Nobody ever asked us about that.
What if it finally happens, but they ask me? Oh, that'd be a disaster.
I can't really think of anything that, like, people ask, I don't know, we get good questions. Like, there's never anything like, one of the things that we get asked a lot is, like, is there anything else you want to say? And I'm always like, no, that was good. Good job.
No, I don't like to talk. Thank you.
Who's next?
That guy over there I saw. I'm sorry, you should pick.
No, you should do it. It's your event.
I was sitting in the power seat in the middle, and I just felt
Oh, yeah, no, that's
just
true.
a surge of confidence.
True. No, go ahead and write it.
So I was in the audience at New York Comic Con, and I recall you guys described a lot of what happens in Night Vale as apparently malevolent but ultimately harmless. And I was listening to the podcast recently, to the Desert Bluffs episodes, where things were apparently harmless but covertly malevolent, especially with regard to Strix Corp. And I was wondering how you guys got into the mindset for that sort of change of tone with Night Vale, if that changed your process of writing, thinking, anything with regard to that.
Yeah, I don't know. You always write towards what your goal is, and so the goal there was to, with them, is to create this sort of strenuously corporate language that is often used in the real world to dull horrible things like taking people's homes away from them. We find nicer ways to say that because the actual truth is horrifying. And so you use that same language. So with Desert Bluffs, it's a lot of that. It's the same thing when we write from the point of view of people who aren't Cecil, when we have the faceless old woman who secretly lives in your home, or Carlos, or Steve Carlsberg, Michelle Wynn. They each have their own point of view, and so you just have to kind of get into what that point of view is and make sure that everything you're doing works towards it. Even, if you have something that's really funny or really beautiful, but it doesn't fit what that character would think, then it has to go. Thank you for your question.
With a universe as big and as unwieldy as Night Vale, I guess in terms of how much stuff there is in it, how do you keep all of that straight and build a story that kind of builds on itself without forgetting what happened 100 episodes ago?
Do you keep a story Bible? Do you have a story Bible?
They do not keep a story Bible.
It really helps having a co-writer, because there's definitely times where you have somebody there to catch those things. I mean, a lot of it is that, you can search through scripts and you can look up things. So a lot of times we will go back through old scripts and find a character or a place or something that you're like, I'd like to touch on this again. I think this would be interesting to build on this character. We just the last 3 episodes have been about the character Tamika Flynn. And one of the things in writing those episodes was to kind of go back through and be like, how old is Tamika? Like, when is her birthday? Did we ever said that? And then there is a moment where we had mentioned around about the time that she would have been born, which would have been mid-October. So you make reference to that, and you can search for that. And so you can just look up anything about Tamika in any script and figure out what's been said about her. And you kind of you research your own writing for future things that you're writing. Some of it gets a little bit hard. A good example of that's hard to search for was there was a moment where I was trying to remember whether or not Cecil lived in a house or an apartment, and it's very hard to look that up. It was just like a difficult thing to...
He lives in a house.
He does live in a house, but I remember having that difficulty. I think I actually asked Joseph if he knew, and I got that answer. But sometimes
he used to live in an apartment, and then when he moved in with Carlos,
Thank you. She knows too.
Thank you. We'll just call you next time.
But that's a good example of like how just basic facts sometimes get lost, and you just want to go back and double check them and look those things up. Like real basic stuff that I think a lot of fans probably actually know off the top of their head. I might not.
I was going to ask, do you check the fan wikis to see, like, have you ever done that? Because they're out there.
I don't
You guys
I
have
don't
them?
100% know always the accuracy of those things, so generally no. Like generally it's much more trustworthy for me to just search Google Docs for the name of the character and just read through all that stuff, because I don't want to trust something on the internet and then I've based my continuity on something that was wrong, and then we're just going off, and then we've just switched timelines, and that's fine. Now we're in a new timeline of Night Vale.
I'll tell you where I use the fan wiki is when I write an episode, and if I write because there's the intro line of blah, 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 welcome to Night Vale, and then at the end there's Meg's proverb. And so if I write either of those lines in an episode, I will use the fan wiki because the Google Docs can be a little unreliable in searching for phrases. And so I'll use the fan wiki because there's a fan wiki that lists every single intro line and every single proverb. And so I'll go through there. I'm like, have I used this joke before?
I absolutely, I don't necessarily go to the wiki, but I always Google those things because after 116, sometimes you're like, oh, yeah, no, episode 10, I already made that joke. Okay.
It's your turn. You should pick one, Joseph.
What was it like working with Retta and her recording her partner, Josie?
You should talk about this, Jeffrey. You
Yeah,
were the one that worked with her.
when we were trying to think of somebody to voice old woman Josie's part, I was in a conversation with Kevin R. Free, who plays Kevin, and Kevin went to school with Retta, so they're very good friends. And so he was like, if you want Retta to, you should just ask her. She's really nice. I bet she'd really love to do it. And so he gave me her email address, and I was like, do you not want to ask her? He's like, no, just ask her. She's really nice. And so I just sent her an email being like, hey, we do this show. I know Kevin R. Free, and would you like to do it? She's like, I don't know your show, but I love Kevin. Sure. And so, yeah, she did. She was always like real quick turnaround, made it easy. One of the recordings came out, like her mic was weird, and I sent it back and I was really nervous because I was like, oh God, she's really busy. I bet we're going to lose this recording. She's like, oh yeah, I'll just redo that. Yeah, she was great. I really loved working with her. I've never met her in person. I only have a relationship over email with her.
Do you have an end game plan? Like as a novelist, you kind of know where you want to go with the end of your book, but with your podcast, do you know in the future it's going to end eventually?
No. Yeah, I mean, it'll eventually end. I apologize to the person at the New York Comic Con because I'm just going to repeat my answer from there. I think what I've started consciously basing what we're doing with Night Vale on is, does anyone read Love and Rockets?
Oh, yeah.
Congratulations on reading a really good thing. Everyone else, read Love and Rockets. Love and Rockets is a comic series, I guess you could say, written by two brothers. Well, three brothers for a bit, but two brothers mostly. That started in 1981. It's really actually two entirely different storylines, one from each brother. And the one I really love is Jaime Hernandez, Las Locas. And it's this story about these women in Southern California, actually right near where I grew up. So it's also interesting for me. It's the town. It takes place in the town one over from where I grew up. But they've been doing it continuously since 1981, and what they've done that has made it really interesting is the characters age in real time. All of those people who were teenagers in 1981 are now middle-aged and, not in the careers they thought they would have, and worrying about the way that their lives have gone, and then, colliding again with people that they haven't seen in 10 years and that we haven't seen in 10 years because the thing is written in real time. And it really gains this incredible emotional weight because it happens at the pace of life, and they allow things to happen. Somebody gets in an accident and it fairly badly, they get fairly bad brain damage, and then that character that's a thing they deal with for the rest of the series because it happened, and that's their life now. And so I think I really look at that when I look at Night Vale. It's not, as Jeffrey said, it's not lost. It's not, why is this place weird? Let's answer that. It's more just a community, and I think as long as we're writing it, I don't know how long that'll be, but I just want it to grow and have them age and change and have life happen to them, because that's what's interesting to me.
Yep.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Oh no. Oh, let's go green.
Okay. So what was it about either the story or the characters or the themes of Into Towers that made you decide to want to tackle that in a book rather than an episode of the podcast or even a mini article of the podcast like the Comedic Lemons?
Yeah, it was when we finished the first novel and we were talking about what the second novel would be, we kind of had the phrase joyous congregation of the smiling God in our heads, and we were like, what are some general topics we could do a book on? And we had a couple things, and Yeah, I think one of them was the Glow Cloud, but we also were like, we had this idea for a touring live show that would handle the Glow Cloud. And just having more room to kind of play around in the Joyous Congregation made a lot of sense, because we thought there would be so many great characters here to build on. There'd be so many people in that church, so many other facets of that may not be something we could capture through Cecil's voice or even like Kevin's voice on the show. And the novel seemed like a great place to just kind of like spread that out. And then we also had the idea of like with all of our novels going forward of like wanting to tell individual stories in those novels, not have them be sequels of each other. Not have them be a progression that you have to read in any particular order, but all in the same world. And so we took Nilanjana, who is one of Carlos's lab assistants in the first novel. She's briefly mentioned, and we're like, well, let's take her and let's have her be a main character. She's not ever been in the podcast. Let's explore that. So it just sort of made sense once we talked more and more about it that the novel was the way to go with that story.
Yeah.
I feel like I cut this guy blue off too. Like I pointed like vaguely in this general direction. Yeah.
It's your turn.
What I wanted to ask was, what do you both think is the purpose of literature? Do you have similar theories about it?
Good luck.
What is the purpose of literature? I don't know.
So do you agree, do you think, on what the purpose is, and has that...
Do
he and
the
I
two of
agree?
us agree?
Yeah.
Have we ever had a discussion about what the purpose of literature is?
I mean, we had the discussion of whether it's good or bad. Joseph likes it. I sort of hate it.
Yeah. We've had the usual pro-con.
It's cash, by the way. The spoiler here is the purpose of literature is cash. You have a mortgage, you got...
I think so. All right, I'm going to land this in a place that I can answer that has nothing to do with your question, but it is a place that I have something to say about. And that is the purpose of literature. I think, so Jeffrey and I both kind of came into orbit around this theater company, the New York Neo-Futurists. There is also Neo-Futurists in Chicago and in San Francisco and in London. And it's a very specific artistic philosophy, and it's one that is all about constantly creating new work and throwing away what you've already made. They do this show that is 30 plays in 60 minutes. These are all pre-written plays, written by the people that perform them. They're not improv, but they're obviously very short. And then at the end of each week of doing it, you throw away a big chunk of them, sometimes sometimes over a third of the show, just gone. And being in the orbit of that show for years, you really learn a lot about art that is counterintuitive to, I think, how society often thinks about art. Art is a thing that should be preserved. We should look to the classics. We should use these classical models. And neo-futurism is about constantly making art and not worrying about preserving it. You just do the art, and you do the art about what's happening now. You do the art about your community. You do the art about your own life, and you put it out there, and then you forget about it. That's done. You start making new art, and that, I think, has really, really strongly affected my own approach to art. I don't care that much about what I've already made. I just constantly am like, well, what's the next thing that I'm making? Because the art, I think, in a lot of ways should be just a continuous reaction to what is going on in the world and in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that I think that art, disposable art thing is really important, because as an artist, it keeps you moving forward. It keeps you not being precious about old things you've already done, or spending too much time on one thing and just saying it's time to get an idea out there. And as far as like literature goes, it is really interesting. One of the more inspiring authors, and I'm not going to put him up as saying like he's one of my favorite authors, but what he was trying to do with the form was so fascinating, is a mid-century English author named B.S. Johnson. And his most well-known book was called The Unfortunates. And what it was he wrote this book while he was he had gone to he was a part-time writer covering soccer matches in England, and he had gone up to, I forget the name of the town, but some town in North England. And while he was there, he remembered a friend of his that he knew when they were young that lived there, and his friend died very young of cancer. And he had all these memories flood back to him, and he just started writing these memories down. And the way he wanted the book published is that each memory, some were like half a page long, and some were 20, 30, 40 pages long. He wanted each of them bound separately. And so the book was sold with just stapled together chapters inside of a box shaped like a book. And so it was very important to him because he did not feel that memories happen in order, or that they happen one after the other, and that you should just put onto the reader. Part of the beauty of reading is that you can change the order of things, and so he wanted people to read these in a random order depending on it. And I was really inspired by his thoughts. He had these really, really strong beliefs on what a novel should be, and that novels were dead and old and stupid, and that we should be using the printed word in a new way. And so he had one particular book, I don't remember the name of it, and it went out of print because it was so expensive to print, but he had there was a moment where there was a single sentence that basically describes the fate of a character, and 20 pages ahead of time, he had that sentence, the shape of that sentence scored out of all of those pages. So as you read through, there was always a hole in the book that showed you what was going to happen to that character, and as you kept flipping the page. And I was always very inspired by that idea of if you throw out the idea that we should be beholden to the classics, to the old structures of literature, I think you can come up with some really amazing ideas. And maybe those are not economically sound. Obviously the publisher wanted to stop printing that book because it's very expensive to make. But I think stuff like that is really stunning.
I remember a story. Faulkner originally, I believe, he wanted Sound and the Fury published with the different characters, their dialogue, their thoughts, their interior monologues printed in different colors. And the publisher basically said, Bill, this will retail for $2,500. There's no way. And so it's all, it's black and white, which became the bane of high school and college students, reading that book forever after. But he tried to make it easier. They wouldn't let him.
How are we doing on time?
It's 15 past. Do we have time for one more?
Let's do one more. Who has the best question?
So we have a battle royale.
You have the best question. Go ahead.
Your question. How has the current political landscape...
I pointed at someone else, but you're going to go, and then they'll still be the last person.
Sorry, we're mainly pointing tonight. I apologize.
We are terrible pointers. Go ahead, please.
political landscape affect the way that you write Night Vale and writing in general?
Yeah, it's tricky because we write a dystopia, and so when the world starts to look like that sucks. Yeah, I think Jeffrey says it best. You don't want to make despotism look cute. And so when we have these characters that are, act that role in Night Vale, we could be a little more playful with them, and we can't so much anymore. We have to be careful not to turn jokes we make into excusing that behavior. We have to be a little more careful with our satire. We had a discussion last night with the crowd on what we write as satire. But the political stuff we write, I think we do have to make sure we're never excusing that behavior for the sake of making a more interesting character. Because as a writer, you always want to make a character more sympathetic, because human beings always have different sides to them. But you always, you don't want to make the person who is doing terrible things in the government in Night Vale too sympathetic or start excusing what they're doing. All right, the best question in the room, go.
Did you have trouble finding someone to voice Erica?
Oh, that's interesting. Erica, the voicing the angels was a thing where we it was in that same show that I mentioned earlier that Hal Lublin played Steve for the first time, where we had all of these thrilling adventure hour people that were just like, they were available that night and wanted to come by and do parts on the show. So we had Hal Lublin, who plays Steve, and Mark Gagliardi, who plays John Peters, the farmer. And we had Mark Evan Jackson, who's amazing, and also Annie Savage, and Jackson Public. And so we had all these people, and so we were like, well, Jackson Public does Venture Brothers, and he does all these amazing voices. Like, he has to be Hiram McDaniels. So like that was an instant thing that we had to do. But then we also had this character of Marcus Vanston, local billionaire, who's really disaffected and just kind of like in his own world. And Mark Evan Jackson seemed perfect for that. And then we had a bunch of small characters that just had really brief parts in that script, and the Ericas. The angels, who are all named Erica. The Erica characters were just really brief moments, and so we had, I think, Hal voiced one, and then Annie Savage and not Mark Evan Jackson, Annie Savage and Hal Lublin voiced.
Yeah, those
the
were
characters.
the two.
Yeah, because also the Ericas are genderless too, so it also became a thing too where you wanted to. So it was a thing where we just had a moment where we had the same Erica character with just different voices is how we played it at the time.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, y'all. Hey, thank you for closed captioning this. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'm sure someone will tell you how the signing works. I don't know.